Hi, Misha here, and let's talk about East German Kalashnikovs, East German AKs. Although, unfortunately, I just have mine here, an MPI-KM, built from my kit, but at least it's intact marking and majority matching numbers. And the reason I was kind of thinking about East German AKs is I found a kit or two in storage recently, and thought we would kind of just go over them in this video. Why not? Again, this is a kit build. There are no true imports. There are some early ones that have the barrels intact, but this is a Polish barrel, and of course whatever receiver you want to use is fine. And this is an East German mag. They take standard AKM mags, although they do have a unique sling and sling swivel arrangement, and no cleaning kit compartment in the butt plate. But we'll get into all those details and more. But as you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And we'll talk AKs for a little while. How about that? Even though this is a build, it is smooth, and that's an attribute to the original German parts. So with no further ado, let's dive in. East German Kalashnikovs are rare in America. There were no pre-ban imports, and sadly no post-ban, post-reunification imports either. So we're stuck with parts kits. But for various geopolitical reasons, and because a lot of the rifles weren't even in East Germany upon reunification, it would take years to get the guns in. Many would originally come from the Middle East, where they were captured by Israel by the PLO, and they would be refinished and reworked and yada yada yada. They would have the original barrel, but often were mismatched, reworked, new finish on them. In 2005, we had the barrel ban, which explains why kits we've received since then, most coming out of the Balkans, do not have barrels. So I'm just talking about in general their guns. But the original milled Kalashnikov out of East Germany is even rarer than the stamped, and I do not have one. Kits are uncommon, and every time I've tracked one down, it's turned out to be kind of a put together, a clutch together with various parts. So, to represent, I brought out my Hungarian FEG AK-55, which, like the East German, is a licensed copy clone of the AK-47 AK Type 3. In 1955, Soviet Russia started allowing for licensed production of the Kalashnikov. Before that, they would sell them or give them to friendly nations, but now they were essentially giving away, although there were always strings attached, production rights and tooling and all that. Not just with the AK, but also the SKS. In fact, it was a kind of a package deal, and a lot of nations ended up with guns they didn't necessarily need or want. And East Germany, we can call it the GDR or the DDR, German Democrat Republic, People's Democratic Republic, or Deutsche, if you prefer. Either way is fine. Before 1956, they had a people's police force. But then, once the Bundeswehr was established in West Germany, in 1956, this led to the establishment of the National Volksarmee, the National People's Army, NVA, which encompassed the Army and, of course, the Air Force, Air Defense Service, and the Navy, too. They would need guns. So by 1956, they were negotiating with Russia to get some of their guns. And while the new East German communist military would have uniforms, and they would have a lot of the old ceremonies, even quite a few old Wehrmacht officers, their way of acting, their structure, their organization was very Soviet and of course very closely monitored and controlled. So in 1956, work began between the DDR and USSR, and the DDR would be one of the few nations to actually produce the SKS outside of Russia, known as the Carabiner S. These are very uncommon today, and they were made primarily between 1958 and 1960, although no one knows exactly when they started and when they finished. They seem to have been produced at the Ernst Thalmann factory in Suhl, which is a major weapons facility. Of course, this introduced 7.62 by 39. A lot of irony there because of the STG-44 and the 8mm Kurz round. As for the Kalashnikov, negotiations for it would wrap into 1957, and then a deal would be struck. And development for a domestic variant would begin at the Visa factory in Thuringia, which was East Germany, communism, whatever. You have VEBs, you have VEBs, where it's basically nationalized conglomerates, and they're all related, and it gets confusing, and names change, and they merge, and it doesn't matter. But it was a smaller factory, a little ways outside of Seoul, like I said, in Thuringia, and they would work on their variant. And by 1958, they had it up and going. They produced a pre-production series known as the Zero Series, much as Germans had always done, and their plan was to make 30,000 that year. That didn't happen. But anyway, let's talk about it. In East Germany, the Kalashnikov AK Type 3 was known as the MPI-K, Marstein pistol, and then the I is pretty traditional marking for German guns like MPI-18 and 28II and so on and so forth. I've seen some sources say it stands for fixed stock. Okay, whatever. K for Kalashnikov, pretty obvious. Now you might be wondering, why didn't they call it the STG-K? I don't think anyone really knows. We're going to run into a bunch of secrecy. One theory is Sturmgewehr was too closely associated with Hitler, the name literally. So for political reasons, they just wanted to avoid it. That's possible. However, I would like to point out that in the 50s, quite a few nations actually classified the Kalashnikov as a machine pistol or submachine gun. Poland calling it the PMK, for example. Hungary here called it the AK-55, but, they didn't really know where it would fit in. So you would say, well, the Germans would know. They created the design. And I agree. That's why I said it could be either one. It could also just be subterfuge. If we classify this as a submachine gun, machine pistol, it's less threatening. Either way, that's the name they picked, and that's actually the name they would ride with throughout in the entirety of production. The MPI would remain with a dash and then the model behind it. So the Hungarian here is a very, very, very close copy of Russian. 16.25-inch medium heavy barrels, slab side handguards, wood pistol grip, wood stock. The Hungarian wood was a different type than the Russian Arctic birch. Originally, this would have had a blued finish, quite high quality, although during refurbishment, Hungary would actually give it a phosphate finish. And they would all make the ribbed mag. Your slab mags, your alloy waffles, those were only made within Russia, although they might have been used elsewhere. And, of course, a muzzle nut was standard. So your MPI-K would look very, very similar to this, including the milled receiver, machined receiver. But the differences would be really two areas. First, there would not be a cleaning rod under the barrel on the German. Second, there would not be a storage compartment for a cleaning kit in the German. Instead, they kept their cleaning gear in their belt or pack in a tobacco can style kit. You've seen them, I bet. That's one. Second, the sling. This is a Hungarian sling. Like a Russian, it's about 1 1/4 wide, although it's a unique pattern. The German sling was actually very much based on what was used on the, well, MP44, MP40, which itself was a development of the Carabiner 98 sling. So it was an inch wide leather, and it actually had kind of a K98 style pass-through in the stock. So instead of having the sling attachment here, it was actually further back. And that also partially explains why there wasn't a cleaning kit, because there was actually a hole in the stock for the sling. So it was outfitted for a different sling and different cleaning gear. The only other real difference of note with the GDR or DDR variant from the Visa factory, was the type of wood. They too did not use the Arctic birch. In fact, they used beech wood, at least as far as I know. Again, data is a little hard, and what's the problem is, even if you can find a kit, has it been reworked, refinished, or is it 100% original? And they were very secretive. Anyway, different wood. Otherwise, very high quality gun, very high grade blued finish, at least in theory. While the 0 series was fine, once they tried to go into full production, they found between 1958 and 1960 especially, parts were either not passing quality control or were slipping through inspection, and then out of spec when they tried to do final assembly and testing. In fact, it got quite bad, with rejection rates over a quarter, at some points almost 50% for certain components. And this slowed production way down, and might explain why these were kind of peak years of production for the Carabiner S, which I believe was being made at the subsequent Ernst Thalmann factory. Either way, what they ended up having to do was implement a new system where essentially the people, the workers, were docked. Their pay was docked for every bad part they either made or let slip through QC. Eventually, by the end of 1961, this improved things. Now, they also went to new machining, new tooling, and I'm going to be honest too, you're starting to see a new generation of more dedicated communists at this point. You go back to the 50s, you've got a lot of old Germans in there, and the political indoctrination really hadn't kicked in yet. By 1960, 61, 62, you have a younger group coming in that were grown up and raised, and yeah, so everything comes together so that by 1962, MPI-K production is pretty much at full rate. And this would continue through 63, 64, and they're hitting their target goals. And these were not just being made for the NVA, again, the People's Army. They would do them for export. In fact, the USSR, I know this will shock you, was perfectly happy to use client states, Warsaw Pact member states, to give them plausible deniability. They did it with Czechoslovakia, and they did it with East Germany, and so on and so forth. They exported and ended up being quite a major arms exporter for the Com Block. In fact, in certain years, the largest. Of course, just like the original Kalashnikov, this was chambered for 7.62 by 39. They were making ammo. Now, they had been using some old World War II era MP44s and some 8mm Kurz ammo too, but by the 60s they had enough to phase these out. Now, the People's Army was originally a volunteer force, a professional force, but after the Berlin Wall was constructed and political tensions went up, around the Cuban Missile Crisis, conscription began, and this let it grow. It started off quite small and modest, then about 80,000, and then it would hit about 100 to 120, and then eventually 130,000, and then stay there for a point. But it would need guns. Of course, the SKSs it built were already obsolete, and while some would be kept around for guard duty, ceremonial duty, some police duty, border guard duty, most were given away to other nations, including North Vietnam. In fact, quite a few of the very few number of Carabiner S's in America came out of the Vietnam War, and seems like the bulk would go to the Balkans and elsewhere, so they're gone. The AK is important. Of course, they are also making the Makarov M pistol in East Germany at the Ernst Thalmann factory, and this too. However, in 1961, the Russians gave the Germans a present. Sometime later on that year, the very first modernized Kalashnikovs were sent over, the AKM. Now, these were purely Soviet-Russian-made guns. I don't know if they were Tula or Ishesk. This early in Tula production, I would think probably Ishesk, but I could be wrong. Either way, that's actually one of the many reasons I wanted to get an early build, like you've seen in several videos now. It really provides a good comparison. And a gun like this, being 1960 dated, at least the parts, would be very, very similar to some of the first ones sent to the DDR, their first experience with the new gun. And this could really help them increase their production. This machined receiver is really nice, but takes a lot of time to machine and quite a bit of steel. This 1mm stamped receiver, a lot faster. Yes, it has a machined front trunnion and rear trunnion, still faster. But it also is a much lighter gun. It's a couple of pounds lighter thanks to a slimmer barrel profile and kind of slimmed down furniture, top cover in general. So they could really produce a lot of these for their own use as their military expands, and for export to friendly nations to be a cozy member of the Warsaw Pact and the friendly communist people. And I brought this out because seeing a gun like this, relatively early production, kind of shows you why the next gun is the way it is. The AKM was designated as the MPI-KM for Kalashnikov modernized within East Germany. And this is mine that you've seen. It's the only one I own. Mostly because the kits are just not super common, and you get what you get. So I'll do my best for you. And the broad strokes, yes, it is very similar to an early Russian. Like I said, they got the first samples in 61. In October of 1962, East Germany received the first, what we would think of as TDP, but it's not really what they called it, but data package, essentially, machinery, tooling, blueprints, and they prepared to transition over. And we would see both the Visa and Ernst Thalmann factories making this version, at least eventually. And again, they were essentially under the same VEB, so did it really matter? I don't know. By 1964, they were ready to start making pre-production, and even though I can't confirm this 100%, 64 East German guns seem to be built with a large number of Russian parts. And this would continue through 65, although we see more and more domestic parts. 1966, that was the first year of true, full East German production. And since it is based on earlier plans, we do have pretty early features. Now, originally it would have had the simple muzzle nut, has the non-lightning cut front sight, the original machined gas block without the lightning cut down here as well, standard profile barrel, has the kind of early style top cover, the non-lipped takedown button catch. One interesting change they did has to do with the rear sights, though. The Soviet AKM had a 1,000-meter rear sight with what we think of as a P battle setting marking. The East German, at least in the beginning, and frankly for the vast majority of production, had an 800 meter rear sight. The reason they went to the 800 meter, well, I should say kept it, was because of the original milled gun. They wanted to have sight commonality with the MPI-K. So, pretty unique, I think. And an easy way to tell an East German rear sight. Now, the East German gun would have the lightning cut bolt carrier and the later O-style rear trunnion. Several other little features. Notice the safeties are kind of the larger pad style on both of these. But we have kind of two big differences. Most notable and iconic, the furniture. As I said, they didn't have access to or didn't want to use the Arctic birch like the Russians did. They tried beech out. In fact, some reports say the early MPI-KMs had beech wood furniture, but they were having issues with it in the cold, moisture, swelling, and it was kind of heavy. Yeah. So they developed this pebble grain plastic stuff. Originally, all 4 pieces. This was introduced by 1966. This buttstock is hollow, at least predominantly so. No storage compartment for a cleaning kit. These pebbles were added for both grip and to make it stronger. If it's in a standard rear trunnion, that's the same. We have a matching pebble-esque pistol grip with checkering in the corners. The front and the sides are actually smooth, kind of that skinny eye shape. Original Russian grips were woods, and they go to what we think of as Bakelite. And as I'm sure you know, the handguards. The upper handguard remained that same kind of brownish plastic. The lower started off as a brownish plastic too, but they discovered that it would get too hot and stick to things or just outright melt in extreme conditions. So they actually reverted back to beechwood with the palm swells. Now some say this is laminate. I always thought of it as hardwood, but maybe it is. But we don't have the pins like we typically see in lamination. So take that for what you will. Either way, the majority would have that, especially even guns that came in from the field for repair that had the plastic lower would often get the wood because it's just better. And only having one wood piece, that was alright. Now this furniture was cheaper to mass produce and made this the lightest AKM in mass production. In fact, one of the lightest AKs at the time, really only being topped by the Hungarian AMD 65. The second major difference, and really the only place where the metal is different, the sling. The Russian sling, very much like what was used from the get-go on the SKS and AK. It evolved a bit over the years, pretty wide. Of course, the positions of the swivels moved a bit with the AKMs. And the East Germans did go away from their kind of Mauser-inspired sling, but they kept the 1-inch diameter. The rear swivel was made more traditional, but smaller. This is just 1 inch wide. But where they're different, the front swivel. And this is easily how you can tell an East German handguard retainer. It's much wider. The standard type is just meant for a clip, so it's quite small. This is wide enough for 1 inch sling to pass through. This is why East German slings, by and large, won't easily fit standard Kalashnikovs There's just not enough room there. It's a very narrow sling, but it's pretty traditional 2-point with keepers, kind of this anti-mildew coating. Yeah, so sling furniture. Unlike the original milled, this does have a cleaning rod under the barrel, but still no compartment in the stock, and they still kept the majority of their cleaning gear either in their belt or in their mag pouch. Several variations in East German pouch exist, although they're pretty much all generally the same, with these kind of cool pull-throughs that go through with metals, and kind of this interesting, again, kind of anti-mildew mold coating on them. Different patterns of fleck tarn or raindrop camo. 4 mags in the pouch with 1 clipped in. And then half of these have this large pocket on the side. Some don't, though. And it has a divider and a place for kind of a cleaning kit rollout pouch. There's also what they call the straight pouch and the curved pouch. And they have belt loops. So generally speaking, East German pouches all look the same. But then you start examining them. Some have a cleaning kit compartment, some don't. Some are straight, some have more of a curve to them. Different colored camo. Cool little variations. As to the mag, this is a Hungarian with kind of a phosphate finish. This is an East German with a blued finish. Pretty much all of your European rib mags look generally the same. The differences come in weld styles, markings, and somewhat the behavior of the ribs, but they're all this light and stamped steel. And these German mags are known for quite good welding. After the initial hiccups in production, 58 to 60, by 1966-67, they really had it up and running and were known for very high quality. And these mags originally were blued, not phosphated, and not phosphate over with paint over it. And that's actually another interesting difference with the East German guns themselves. With the AKM, a new, frankly, cheaper, faster, and easier to maintain finish came in. It was also better protection against rust and corrosion. It was an underlayer, kind of a grayish phosphate, with a layer of gloopy black paint over that, which could easily be redone. A lot of countries went to this finish, but East Germany did not. They stuck to bluing with the MPI-KM series. Now, Poland would blue for the first few years, but by 1970, they went to paint. Actually, East Germany would keep bluing into the 80s, at least for this type, the 760x39 guns. This one is one of the last, what you consider kind of high polish blued finish guns. After 72 or so, the bluing becomes more and more matte. In fact, it almost has a gray hue to it, which is often mistaken for phosphating for park. And you would think that the Germans would use phosphating because, well, they used it in World War II, but on this particular style, they seem to just use different styles and types of bluing. But for the first several years, it was a pretty high-grade bluing, which really meant the machining underneath. The tool marks were knocked off, and they just really took their time. Even the plastic furniture was well molded. Everything was dated and serialized, lots of serial parts on these. They even made quite a neat set of clip-on night sights. And of course they had a typical AKM bayonet to go with it. Now, the MPI-KM takes the standard AKM bayonet. Sorry, I looked for my East German real quick and didn't find it, so I just grabbed a Russian. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. There's a few different patterns they made and hybrids. In fact, these are known for their wire cutter abilities. If I get it in the right direction. I always goof this up, so yeah, that's not it. That's not it. Why didn't you guys tell me? You can tell I'm not cutting wire in a hurry. But that was something that was felt to be a good enough idea that even the US would kind of later copy it, making it more of a multi-tool. Sorry, this strap, I've hooked it on 100 times and it always works loose. That's one of them things. Anyway, standard lug here. And goes on as you'd expect. No surprises here. A little bit of play, but not bad. That's to be expected. This sight right here, guys, an AK with just a bayonet hanging off of it, was something we could not have for 10 years during the assault weapons ban, which is why we all like to do. Now, the East German bayonet is actually kind of a dark color, glossy, similar in appearance to the handguard material and buttstock. So yeah, they tend to be dark brown, sometimes reddish brown, and sometimes almost a black color. And that is your color discussion of the day from a blind person. So with that, let's get back into it. As for the NVA, like I said, they grew after '62. Conscription became mandatory, so everyone had to serve a certain period of time in one capacity or another. And they actually never saw true combat. But they came close and combat adjacent more than a few times. For example, in '68, with the so-called Prague Spring, when the Warsaw Pact, led by the USSR, essentially crushed dissension in Czechoslovakia. East Germany did send the 7th Panzer Division, as well as the 11th Motorized Infantry. And would you believe it? The Czechs didn't like having Germans on their soil again. This was actually the first time that Germans sent troops outside their borders. And yeah, the Czechs really didn't like this, and it was a political hot potato in a situation that was already very politically volatile. So, you've heard the trope of bury your gays? The Russians buried their Germans. They hid them in the forest, didn't let them come in the direct sight as much as they could, and only let them travel at night or, when they couldn't be seen. They were essentially an embarrassment. And they sent them home as quick as they could. So even though they would go into that situation, they didn't ever fire a shot in anger, never saw directly the protesters, and they got their butts out of there as quick as possible, which I think everyone was just kind of happy with. The whole thing was pretty tragic. But yeah, these guns would be in service by that time, along with the older AKMs. But as I said, motorized infantry. So far, we've just talked about guns with a fixed buttstock. Sure, 16-inch barrel, that end's pretty short. And with the AKM especially, we're pretty lightweight. I mean, this is a 7-pound gun with this furniture. But what about folders? That is quite an interesting story. This is where I'm going to disappoint you. I'm a failure as an AK guy because I don't actually have a Russian AKS Type 3, an underfolding stalker. In fact, I don't have a milled underfolder at all right now. I've had them in the past, like the Arsenal SAS M7 Classic, but oh well. The only gun I have that has that style of stock is my Wasser 1063 UF, because while it is a stamped receiver, it actually uses the original pattern underfolding stock. This is the actual machined version with my favorite feature, the clicky butt plate. I just think that's neat. And on this side, it's just a pivot. The other side is the push button. Now, ironically, this stock, Kalashnikov, the Russians, kind of borrowed and modified from the Germans MP40. And ironically, for whatever reason, East Germany didn't seem to have the best luck producing. Now, there was, of course, the MPI-K, the milled, and there was an MPI-KS, a milled with the underfolder. So it would have had this style of stock. But they either didn't like it or just didn't have great luck manufacturing it. Just to flip it over to show the button on the side. Yeah, people always ask about the different styles. So they had this version of a folder, but it wasn't great. And so when they went to the MPI-KM, by 1965, they did work on an AKMS variant, is the MPI-KMS. But they seem to have produced very few, or really maybe only just a few prototypes. Quick aside before I put the washer back. One reason I brought it out was the stock. Another is actually this gas tube. This handguard is Romanian, you might have noticed. But this gas tube's actually later East German because the original one it came with was jacked. But this is that blued finish, the matte blue I was telling you about. And it is bluing, it's just really matte. I took this off a furniture set from a later version. I just wanted to show you that example of 70s, 80s style German bluing. And here is my best example of a stamped AKMS underfolder, my Hungarian SA85M. This is the new style of stock developed. Has the locking latch on this side, like the previous version. But instead of just a hinge on this side, it has 2 more additional locking points, so a total of 4. Much more stable stock. It's also made out of stamped and riveted and dimpled steel versus the original machined. Now, they definitely looked into making these in East Germany. I don't know why it wasn't successful. Some say they had trouble making them. Possibly, but they were pretty smart folks. I think one thing they didn't care for, you had to really do things differently. Not only do you have a different rear trunnion for a fixed versus a folder, it even requires different rivet positions, which effectively means you have to have dedicated receivers. You know, there's no good way to turn this into this and vice versa. Now, the front ends are the same, but yeah, I just have to wonder if for flexibility, commonality, they didn't like that. Also, this style of stock, well, it has pros and cons. When folded up, it is quite compact. There's nothing hanging off the back, sticking out of the back. And it folds up quite nice. But it does increase the width of the gun on each side by nearly an inch. Not a big deal. But it cannot be deployed single-handed. You really need to use 2 hands to get it out. You know, there's a couple of different motions involved. It can also make magazines a little more difficult to deal with coming in and out. And because it is metal, it's heavier. It's heavier than a wood furniture AKM. It's definitely heavier. If you put this stock on this gun, it would increase the weight considerably. So I have to really wonder if those weren't the issues more than manufacturing. Either way, the MPI-KMS doesn't seem to have gotten very far. Limited production or even just prototype production. No, by 68, they were looking for a different solution. And this is one of the first really true innovations we see from the East German AK production line. Aside from the crazy furniture we've already got, of course. Now I get to bring out my Egyptian Mahdi again, specifically because of this crutch folder stock. Because this was not an Egyptian invention. No, it came from East Germany. They worked on this in '69 and started building these in 1970. And would make them for a few years. This was known as the S1 stock, and it was when it was installed on a gun, the gun became the MPI-KM S1. And yeah, you could take any stamped receiver gun with a standard rear trunnion and put this stock on it, and that was kind of the point. It used the same trunnion as everyone else, and because of its construction, it was quite lightweight. We have one single piece of steel, just a bar, straight bar, and then we have sheet metal grafted on the side, and then we have a lever right here to easily fold it. Simply press in and fold it over. Bonk. And it folds over to the side just fine. And to deploy, you can essentially do it one-handed by just squeezing in and flipping it out. Now, there are a few detractions. This is not the most comfy stock, and we do have this block hanging off the back, although it doesn't hang out any further really than the trunnion. And it does add a little bit of girth to the side, but really no more than the handle, in fact even less. So you're not really effectively making the gun wider when folded, and it's not on this side. And while it is metal, so it's going to have some weight to it, especially the internal mechanism here, it's still lighter than the underfolding stock. But our main benefit, we can switch back and forth. I could put this stock on this gun. But this isn't the iconic East German side folder you think of. How did it end up in Egypt? Well, Egypt and Russia had a falling out, and East Germany kind of stepped in around 72, 73 and took their place and helped them with their production at Factory 54, and they gave them some of their S1 stocks, or they gave them rifles with these stocks already on them, so essentially MPI-KMSs. And the Egyptians loved them. In fact, the troops that got these really prized them. A lot more compact, kind of unique looking, what have you. So after the Yom Kippur War in 73, East Germany actually transferred all the production, the tooling, the know-how for this style of stock to Egypt. I'm sure they sold them, but you know what I mean. And Egyptian-produced crutch folders really only have two differences. One, they went to the more standardized 1 1/4 swivel. The original East German-made ones had the 1-inch swivel. And two, they gave it their standard paint over phosphate finish. Again, the original East Germans were blued, either polished or matte, kind of that transitional period. So they made those few changes. Now, the S1 folder was never used, at least officially, by East Germany. It was a stepping stone, but to them it was a failure. To Egypt, it was successful. Goes to show you what's some person's junk, trash, is someone else's treasure, and this stock is very famous for Egypt. But very quickly, we would get probably the most successful East German design, which again, I'm going to disappoint you, I don't have. We're talking, of course, about the MPI-KM 72. But even to the Germans, that was a bit of a mouthful, so it really was just known as the MPI 72. And this will stand in for it. What they did was essentially take their standard rifle up here, add the side folding stock. They would go from the muzzle nut to the slant brake, like is on this one, and we would get a new pattern lower handguard. And around this time, the bluing would go from the high polished to more of the matte blue. That's the 72. Let's talk about the stock, even though I brought my Tantal out. And that's because this stock was copied by the Polish nearly exactly, and simplified and copied by the Romanians too. This is the 72 style folder. Very much the same mechanism here, but now we have a single piece of steel bar that is curved, bends around, and then welds upon itself. In fact, this butt plate, you might think is a separate piece. No, this is actually the same bar, just flattened out and ribbed. And then they added a rubber bumper here to make it better when it folds over. And again, it would plug into a standard rear trunnion. This was a very successful design. Even if it has its detractions, overall, the benefits outweighed it. With the 72, also finally did away with the wood lower handguard. They went to a new pattern of what we think of as Bakelite. Now, not this style of Bakelite, like on the Polish. Even though it's a similar material, instead of having palm swells here, there are actually vertical ribs in a little rectangle on each side. And we still have a brown plastic upper, and we would have a kind of plastic pistol grip beside. So that didn't change. So just to reiterate, changes for the 72. We went to the side folding stock as a standard thing, even though a fixed stock could be installed if we needed. The bluing went from high polish to more of a matte grade. We switched from a muzzle nut to a slant brake, although this might have been with late KMs as well. And to go along with the new stock, we have a new Bakelite pattern lower handguard, even if the upper and the pistol grip stayed basically the same. Here's the 72 style Polish copy folded. Notice the bumper hitting up against the receiver. And the only reason I say basically the same, early styles tended to be more reddish brown. Later on, the color shifted to what's referred to as chocolate brown. This isn't a hard and fast rule, but good rule of thumb. Now, these are dated internally, so if you pull the stock off, there is a date code, so you know when it's made. And in fact, at the tail end of production, 88, 89, they even made some black, or at least charcoal, furniture. And that goes to show you that the MPI-KM, MPI-KMS72 stayed in production throughout the duration of the DDR. So there were changes, but overall, they had pretty much nailed the pattern down. By the way, the reason I have a sugar scoop on this, partially because it's a very late style early gun, partially because it's so light, every little bit to help with recoil I'm going to take. And again, Poland copied. Ironically, when Poland was having some political unrest in 1981, East Germany, along with other Warsaw Pact members, was on standby to send the the NVAN to suppress things. But martial law were declared in December, and so the Warsaw Pact did not have to directly intervene. I'm sure Poland would have loved to have had both Russian and German troops on their soil again. What could go wrong? Here's a Romanian gun, a Wasser I've set up in PM90 configuration. This has their simplified and export version of their stock. Internally, it's just a little more basic. Anyway, just thought I'd mention that, bring it out, so you have something to look at. I wish I had more guns to show you, but c'est la vie. That was fun. So, the East Germans weren't just active, or potentially active, in Europe. They actually sent so-called military advisors around the world, including to Africa. In fact, in 1973, they went to the Republic of the Congo. They also sent some guys over to Iraq during the 80s, and Syria, and quite a large list of other places. They did not send combat troops to help the Soviets in Afghanistan, but they did send medical and other support personnel there. Like I said earlier, they never saw direct combat, but it came close. In fact, in the 1980s, the NVA would expand its membership again, reaching about 175,000. And that's because if the balloon ever went up, if World War III ever happened, their goal, their assignment, was to take Berlin, at least initially, with some Soviet troops supporting them, but no, that was primarily what East Germany was meant to do. So, really the height of their strength came in the mid-1980s, which kind of makes sense given what was happening at the time. Up to this point, I've talked, and yes, I know this is a talk video. I wish I had more action and variation too, trust me, about these 7.62x39 guns. But East Germany was interested in 5.45x39. In fact, really, it was only one of two nations outside of the Soviet Union, direct control of the USSR, that had licensed production. The other being Bulgaria. Yeah, Poland and Romania, A, didn't have a license, and B, didn't actually make AK-74s. Now, East German AK-74 kits are exceedingly rare, even ones without barrels, and I just never could bring myself to spend $700 to $800 on a bag of parts, at least not back in the day, so I don't have one. And to be fair, they look pretty much like an early Russian or Bulgarian, so I brought out the SLR-105. Actually, it's got some East German parts with it, so hey. They started negotiating with Russia as early as 1978, but these would not be concluded well until 1981, at which time Russia would agree to let East Germany make the new AK-74 and the new 5.45x39 round. The reason it took so long, well, export rights and sales. Remember how they essentially gave them the AK and AKM? Well, by the late 70s, early 80s, times were changing, economics were real. Russia wanted to reap the profits, which never really came, from the new rifle and cartridge. So the agreement basically said East Germany could make the gun, but only for its own domestic use. It had no rights to export them, sell them, profit, yada, yada, yada. So, there we go. As usual, they had some Russian guns as samples, then they started putting guns together from Russian kits, and then they started making more and more parts domestically. This started by 1983, and it was introduced officially into NVA service in 1985 as the new standard issue gun. It was designated the MPI AK74N for the fixed stock, and the MPI AKS74N for the folder. And essentially they took the same furniture from the MPI-72, including the right side folding wire stock, the Bakelite lower, the brown plastic pistol grip and upper, and threw it on there. Now, the East German 74s did have the paint over phosphate finish. They weren't blued. And some would have 1-inch swivels, and others would have 1 1/4 inch, at least seemingly. This is an East German mag. In fact, they're the only nation outside of Russia to make the AG4 mags, the Bakelite mags. Bulgaria made the polymer mags of different colors. Poland and Romania did their own thing. But yeah, if you see a Bakelite mag, it's either Russian or East German. Unlike Russians, they don't really have a factory symbol on this side. They do have a mold number, typically a couple of digits on this side. These were really cheap at one time, East German bakes. Not anymore. Another thing, and this gun actually has an East German muzzle brake on it, the so-called zigzag brake, because this was used in the 70s in Russia, and because they were getting their data around 81, 82, this was the pattern of brake they went with. Russia would later go to the half moon and other styles. So that's why I brought this gun out, because it has an East German brake, and I could throw an East German mag in it. This is the pouch I keep my East Germans in, for whatever it's worth. Even though I don't have a gun, I have a pouch of mags, because these were $10. Why not? Now, I said the name was MPI-AK74N. What's that N for? Well, I'm glad you asked. While the scope rail was an optional feature at the time on Russian and Bulgarian guns, it was standard for the East German 74. So the N is for rail. That's why I brought out the SLR 104FR. Now this, of course, has the Russian 4.5mm left side folding stock. East Germany didn't do that. Like I said, they stuck to their 72 right side folding stock. And I think because this rail was standard, kind of explains why. They were expecting to use it more, maybe. And even though the optics, night optics or magnified day optics, are expected to return to 0 when you slide them on and off, you do have to take them on and off to utilize this rail. At least if you want to fold the stock. And Germany did have a 4-power optic, as well as a couple of night optics, that they would use with some frequency on their 74s. So I think between just having the parts laid out already, it made sense. So they never went to the unique rear trunnion hinge. They actually kept the same fixed stock rear trunnion, used all the way back with the original AKMs. So that actually stayed the same. Either way, most of them had the side folding stock. While on paper they had a fixed stock variant, in reality, yeah, the East German 74s you see always have the little crutch folder, the wire folder. So basically, it's a standard Russian, Bulgarian, early 80s pattern gun, but with unique East German furniture, a zigzag muzzle brake, and a Bakelite mag if it matters, and then quite a high, nice grade paint over phosphate finish. Fun fact, and this is still debated, but best of what I've been able to tell, even though they put paint over phosphate on their 74s, their 5.45 guns, for their 7.62x39 line, which was still very much ongoing, they stuck with bluing. Now at this point it's a matte blue, almost a gray, but it's still bluing, not phosphate or paint. That's not to talk about refurbishment, repair, replacement in other countries. And like I said, they could make the 5.45 for their own use, and they did. But for export, they were a big exporter at this time. They still exported the 7.60x39 guns, be it the fixed stock or the folder. That's okay because most of the world where they were exporting to, Asia, Africa, even a little in South America, they weren't interested in 5.45. That's actually why Russia never made money on it. No, they still wanted 7.62x39, so they're a lot like Americans today. So this is a perfectly good gun for East Germany to keep in production, and that's why you see them being made concurrently in the 80s with the 74s. Although, again, by this point, they're pretty much all for export, maybe border guard police use within Germany, but probably not. Because by this time, they've been making them for years. They have enough for themselves. Now, they're focusing on the 74. And they would make a decent number, primarily during the period from 85 through 89-ish. Hard to say exactly how many. Under 200,000, most likely. I'll explain at the end of the video why. That's kind of my estimation. So, that's pretty much East German AK production. But we do have a couple of final models that never really got built in large numbers. Should go ahead and mention, since this is obviously a talk video. Why not? No East German MPI story would be complete if we didn't at least talk about the carbine, the MPI-KM74N. I don't know if K was for carabiner or Kurs, but I would imagine Kurs. Anyway, obviously I don't have one. Virtually no one does, but these are two good examples of kind of the idea. Now, the idea of an intermediate length gun, with the 12 to 13 inch barrel, can be traced back to the AMD 65, but that had a separate flash hider and front sight and gas block unit, and used a short gas piston, gas tube. Yeah. The innovation here was for commonality. East Germany was really the first nation to express serious interest in making the AK-74 outside of the Soviet Union, and would be among the first to do so. But the AKS74U, while very compact and whatnot and light, had its serious issues. So they never really looked at it. No, they did kind of what Romania would do a very short time later with the PM90 short rifle, and Russia would eventually do with the AK-102, 104, 105 in the 90s. They split the difference. Standard handguards, standard length gas tube, at least here. This actually has a slightly shorter gas tube, but never mind that. On the East German, it's the standard length gas piston tube, standard handguards. But combination front sight gas block to save length. And they didn't have the Krink style expansion chamber conical flash hider, they just had a flash hider. Interestingly, they did have a bayonet lug, although I think it was mostly just as an accessory lug. They did have a cleaning rod under the barrel. So basically just a shorter front end. Once you get to the handguards, it's the same gun, including having the wire side folder. This is the Romanian export version. Whatnot. So, yeah, the NK looked the same post the front end, but it was quite a bit shorter and a little bit lighter. It was developed around 1986 for tank crews, vehicle crews, mechanized warfare, you know, again, if the balloon ever went up, and for paratroopers and the like, and was put into production by 87, and that should tell you it was only made for a couple of years, which is why, not just in America, semi-automatics, they're rare, but even in Europe, they were exceedingly rare. And, you know, kind of a unique 5.45 gun, but frankly a good idea, because looking at modern Kalashnikovs, you see it more and more. I mean, again, Russia went to it later, Romania a very short time later, although, to be fair, Romania had been playing around with the intermediate length throughout the 80s too, so it was really kind of concurrent development. This one is, of course, in the 7.62x39, but Romania did have a 5.45x39 version. Of course, so did Russia. And those are pretty much the GDR, DDR, NVA issue Kalashnikovs. But there is one more worth talking about and a good way to end the video. The 81 agreement with Russia did not allow East Germany to sell AK-74s in the 5.45 round. But it did not address, say, 5.56. Thus, around 1988 into 89, the Uyghur was unveiled. And this was for the international market, for export, and was essentially an AK, but chambered for 5.56 NATO. One of the first, and it was actually intended for military, not semi-automatic civilian commercial sales. Now, to be fair, only a few thousand were ever made. Plans were underway, and the future looked bright. But, bringing out this Wasser 3, the one element of the Uyghur that endured was the mag. This is a Romanian copy of a Uyghur mag, but I've had the originals before. They were actually available for quite some time because they did make a good number. And they look the same, but with a nicer kind of blued finish. In fact, the STG 940, as it was soon known, they finally got over the STG name, I guess, had quite nice fit and finish, bluing. It had, for the time, an ergonomic pistol grip. For the time, ergonomic extended handguards. A unique buttstock, and it was all black polymer. This also explains why late MPI-KMs had black polymer furniture too. It had a combination front sight gas block unit, kind of like the 74NK, like we looked at. And while they were all in 5.56, we had several variations. There was a standard 16-inch rifle, fixed stock or folding. There was the 940 43, which was a carbine variant. I don't know exactly how long its barrel was, but around 13 inches, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong. And there was even a support weapon, an RPK style gun, known as the 944. So they were planning a whole family. This was for export. This was for money. By 89, communism was failing. Eventually, the Berlin Wall would come down. There would be protests in East Germany, so much so that the NVA was actually put on high readiness. Instead of ever fighting the West in Europe, they could be called upon to oppress their own people. Thankfully, for everyone involved, East Germany never gave the order, and even Soviet Russia told their troops that were still stationed in East Germany to just basically not engage. Stay in your barracks, keep your head down. Yeah, it was de-escalated as it should be, and therefore not tragedy. But the Visa factory was hopeful for the STG 940 and showed it off at trade shows, and there were a lot of nations interested. Again, there weren't 5.56 AKs available. Yugoslavia had done some, but they were falling apart too. East Germany looked like it had a better future than most. Reunification was just a year off. And they actually had a contract with India for 7,500, and it does seem like it was fulfilled. Again, correct me if I'm wrong. They also had a contract with Peru for 10,000. This was not fulfilled. In fact, the government, starting off East Germany, then melding into unified Germany, forced the cessation, the absolute immediate cancellation of all Kalashnikov production at the two arsenals there, or the whole setup. And so even though the contract had been signed and money had traded hands, they had to cancel it, which cost the factory and the German government quite a bit of money and kind of pissed off some people. So a few thousand were made in the SGG series, but yeah, they also made a lot of mags, and that's actually how we have so many today that came into the country in the 90s and 2000s, as well as spare parts. But unfortunately, there were never any semi-automatic-only imports from Germany. If you see a gun that looks like an STG 940 that's an import, it's actually a Romanian gun, and those were in 7.62x39. IO, years ago, did a combo gas block gun with black polymer furniture, typically Tapco, that looked like one of those guns. I believe it was the 2003M or something. You can look it up, but either way. So there is a faux version out there, an inspired by version, but sadly, no imports. That would have been a cool one to get, I'm not going to lie. And it was really the last AK design out of East Germany because, well, after unification, they would very soon drop their Kalashnikovs and sell them off, and this is how they would kind of further proliferate around the world, which is something East Germany had been doing with their AKs for decades. Alrighty guys, and back here at the table. Hope you enjoyed it. Again, I apologize for just having the one, but you know how it is. Kits are hard to find, expensive, and oh boy, the 545, the 74 kits. I've just never been able to bring myself to it. If you can and have, I applaud you. You're a more dedicated AK person than me. We all have our limits. But I think they're neat. Again, they really are just an AKM with one or two changes to the metal. The big difference, the furniture, and of course just the quality of machining. But what do you think? I know around here we mostly talk imports, and I'm still a fan of that when possible. But do you have any kit builds that you like? I think, to my mind, this is where kit builds really to come in, to fill out the collection when there's no other way to do it. The Asian contract comes to mind. Some of the early Polish AKMs, especially before the WBPs were around. Things of that nature, RPK74s. That's kind of when a kit build becomes valid to me. And I don't mind this with the US receiver shell, because you still have the original trunnion bolt group, and even if this doesn't have the German barrel, it has an FB Radom barrel. And here's the thing, your imports, like your Wassers, even if you have a Wasser 1063, that's not the original barrel from whatever trunnion date your Wasser has. That's a new made barrel. Now it's a military spec barrel, but yeah, because when firearms companies want to sell a gun, they want to sell it with new barrels. Plus, legally speaking, there are reasons there too. But that's a story for another day. But I just felt like sharing this because the kits are on my mind. Probably do a couple of videos, see how it goes. With that, appreciate you hanging out, tuning in. If you could, like, share, subscribe. You know the deal. Check out Patreon. And with that, we'll catch you very soon next time.